the Mad Wild West podcast. These are the true stories that made it wild. Well, you made it, my friends, back to the Mad Wild West past. And once again, we got stories that are mad and wild, and they're from the West. In episode 7 today, we're going to the big state of California, where it's all happening. You ever wonder why there's a big grizzly bear on the California flag? Well, you're about to find out why today, and it's bloodier than you may think. Also, it's not always a good idea to put a price on somebody's head. So get your horse ready, strap on your 6-shooter, put your cowboy hat on, because we're going for a ride into the past, and we're going to learn it from the people that live there in the Mad Wild West. All right, a little newspaper time. Here we go. From Los Angeles Daily Herald, October 24th, 1873. This is actually not a headline. This is actually kind of in their want ads at the time. And this is in the property section. Keep in mind, this is LA. One of the most expensive places in the nation. I think it's 4th, 5th, something like that, behind New York, San Francisco, but very expensive place. What's for sale? 13 acres, well improved, 1 1/3 miles from the courthouse. Good house, 44 by 46, including wings. 2 stories, contains 9 rooms, closets, bath, and a storeroom, all hard finished. 3 fine weeping willows grace the yard, 24 bearing orange trees loaded with fruit, 29 white walnut, 88 apple, these are all trees, 18 pear, 4 fig, 4 apricot, 3 pomegranate, and all in fine bearing. 77 orange trees that are 3 years old, 77 walnut trees 4 years old, 100 walnut trees, 200 lemon and lime trees in a nursery. Also, a vineyard of 3,600 vines and 1.5 acres of alfalfa. This place is near Omnibus Line, a good location, healthy and pleasant. For sale, a fine property at a bargain of only $12,000. That's right, 13 acres. It's got 9 rooms. It's got closets, bathrooms, all those trees, 3,600 vines. Crazy for $12,000. Now, November of 2020, and there's a home here. Tried to find something as close as I could. It's a little further out from downtown, close to the courthouse there, like they mentioned. But in this one here, it says it's got 8 bedrooms, and it's on 1.8 acres of mature cypress, palm, oaks, and other landscaping. Refined interior treatments include vintage tin and hand-coffered wood ceilings, floor-to-ceiling windows, disappearing doors, premium limestone and hardwood flooring. But this is not far. This is within a few miles of where that house would be. And the current price is $18,950,000 for 1.8 acres nowadays with an 8-bedroom home. What was it in 1873 in LA? $12,000 for 13 acres and 9 bedrooms. There you go. How times have changed, folks. And by the way, if you're wondering, the estimated payment on $18,950,000 it's showing per month, so it probably doesn't have taxes, is only $83,866 a month. Let's take a look how the Mad Wild West business partnerships were like in 1873. This is another little headline, Los Angeles Daily Herald, again October 24th, 1873. Jose Maria Martinez, the Spaniard who at Anaheim Landing is supposed to have taken his partner in the fishing business, a fellow Spaniard, out upon the bay and to have thrown him overboard, has been brought to this city and put in the county jail. Martinez is a dull, foolish-looking fellow about 35 years of age with a silly expression always upon his face. He is rather short and thick-set and has an ignorantly malicious look. If he committed the murder, as is probable from his confession, he did it simply because he failed to recognize the enormity of his act. He is within the pale of the law. Harsh way to deal with business partners, I guess. Here's a sad one. Frightful accident. A horrible shooting affair occurred yesterday evening on Toro Street in this city, by which a Spanish boy named Valencia, 9 years old, was probably fatally wounded. The Herald reporter visited the locality shortly after the occurrence, and from the parents of the wounded boy received the following details of the affair. Valencia was engaged in play with a group of children near the house of his parents when another Spanish lad, about 17 years of age, named Miguel Contreras, who lives next door, came along carrying an old musket loaded with powder and shot, which he had taken from the armory of a company of soldiers nearby, and with which he had been going through the manual drill. When within 40 or 50 feet of Valencia, he discharged the gun. Whether it was done by design or accident is not clear. The shot struck young Valencia and literally perforated his face and head. Some of the shot entered the eyes and the brain, so as to cause a swelling of the eyelids and temples. The sight of the little fellow as he lay in pain, the blood oozing out his wounds, was painful to look upon. Dr. Orme was summoned and administered all the relief possible under the circumstances, but thinks it probable that the boy will not recover. The officers were after Contreras, but at last account had not succeeded in finding him. I'll tell you one thing, these soldiers weren't Marines, because a Marine would never, ever let anybody get their rifle. Anyway, sad story there. But those are the things that only happen during the crazy Mad Wild West days. There's a section called Local Brevities. Just some quick little information that they would post in a section of the newspaper here. In the article entitled Where to Find a Home, the population of Los Angeles should be given at 9,000. So 1873, they're saying about 9,000 people. Dr. Kurtz, county coroner, yesterday held an inquest upon the body of Christopher Akin. The deceased had taken a drink of water yesterday about noon, after which he dropped down dead. Therefore, the deceased has been supposed to be poisoned. Coroner's inquest with written post-mortem examination of the body, however, elicited the fact that he died with atrophy of the heart. Deceased was 36-year-old and a native of France. It doesn't get much more Wild West than this. Here it is. Visalia, California. Stagecoach robbed. Arrest of the ringleader. Visalia, December 1st, 1873. On Saturday night, about 9 o'clock, the stage was stopped by masked highwaymen about a mile from the city, in the same spot where it was robbed 6 weeks ago. The officers were at once notified and started in pursuit. One man, supposed to be the ringleader, was arrested about 30 miles from the scene of the robbery, having in his possession coin which was recognized as having been taken from the Wells Fargo and Company treasure box. The stage driver also recognized him as the party who stopped the stage 6 weeks ago. Ooh, busted. There you go. I wonder what happened to those guys, how long they had to spend in prison. They usually didn't hang you for that, but definitely will have some prison time. There you go. Mad Wild West headlines. So the main stories that I'm going to read for you today were written in the 1850s by a gentleman that was a California Ranger. So let's take a look at what he says about bears. And like I mentioned earlier, why is the grizzly bear on the California flag? Well, let's read what he has to say here, and I think get a better idea of why the grizzly bear is on the California flag. At the time of which I write, early in the 50s, grizzly bears were more plentiful in Southern California than pigs. They were in fact so numerous in certain localities like Topanga, Malibu, La Laguna, Lopez, and other places as to make it the rearing of cattle utterly impossible. Those ferocious brutes were the terror of the aboriginal tribes and dreaded by the California Spaniard, whose only weapon of offensive warfare against them was the Rita and Lance, more commonly called in gringo language the lasso. When burly Bruin, in the quest of food, would boldly emerge from his lair in the fastness of the Sierra and make his appearance on the plain, he ran 9 chances out of 10 of losing his scalp. When beset by 3 or 4 lassadors, he was most generally overpowered and spitted. And this is the way in which that most wonderful feat, lassoing a grizzly, was performed by those most formidable men on horseback, whose likes will never be known again, the California ranchero. When seen on the open plain, a party of the most intrepid, cool-headed, well-mounted, and expert lassadors surround him. Bruin, finding himself corralled, seats himself upright on his haunches and takes the defensive position. A Lassador now approaches him and swings his Rita. There must be no mistake about it. The bear must be caught by one of his forefeet. That is the first thing to be done. Bear in mind, reader, the monster may be of 2,000 pounds weight, and if caught around the body or neck, he takes hold of that Rita and draws the horse and rider hand over hand as easily as a fisherman would draw a catfish. The coil of the lasso describes a rapid circle, whiz, a whirl. Bruin's eyes wall from side to side in vain endeavor to know where the blow is about to fall, and his two immense arms gyrate wildly, as though he intended to make the right, left, the front, and rear come together at one and the same time and the same motion. Whiz, whirl, whip goes the Rita. The Lord Grizzly is caught by the forepaw. In a twinkling of an eye, whiz, whirl, whip goes another Rita, and the astonished monster is caught by the other forefoot. He now angrily and with gashing of teeth and terrific growls stands erect and waltzes around like a madman. But the next thing he knows, whiz, whirl, whip, and the Rita tightens on his hind foot. And before he can enter his growling protest, he is caught by his other hind foot and is tripped up and falls heavily on his back, where he struggles desperately for life. But 4 well-trained horses and 4 cool-headed, fearless riders with their terrible Ritas are too much for him. And in a few minutes, the monster, with groans and growls, with heaving chest and dilating eyes, surrenders and lies on his back as helpless as a child, whereupon he is approached by 1 or 2 lookers on and is dispatched with their lances. This is the way grizzly bears were captured and slain in the olden California times. A dangerous performance surely, for even now, with needle guns and Winchester rifles, it is a most hazardous undertaking to attack a bear, and whoever does, it runs more risk of life and limb than he would ever have ran at Shiloh or Antietam. I could relate many singular encounters with grizzly bears in early times, and I will now relate a few that are more fixed in my mind. The first of which I remember was that of Jim Boggs of Sonoma County in 1850. Jim was out one day with a companion and spotted a good-sized grizzly grazing along the grass. Jim's partner, being somewhat dexterous in throwing a lasso, caught the old boy around the body, whereupon the bear took a seat and quietly drew in the man and horse. And most unfortunately, the end of the Rita was tied to the saddle. The horse struggled to escape. The saddle was turned. The rider fell off and was caught by the bear. And by some means or other, the horse freed himself from the saddle and ran away. Boggs, finding his companion in the terrible toils of the monster, drew his revolver and bravely approached, placed the muzzle against the side of the bear's head, and fired. The bear at once released the man, who took to his heels and left Jim and the bear to fight it out. Jim got in one more shot, and then the bear pounced upon him and likely killed him, as the bear thought. Finding himself in the monster's clutches, Jim pretended to be lifeless, was only considerably bitten and torn into pieces. The bear left him and started away. Jim said, "I turned over a little, raised my head, and there went the old bear licking her chops. But just as I raised my head, she turned her eye, and we looked at each other square in the face for an instant, when the bear turned around and sprang upon me, just as I've seen a cat spring upon a mouse. It took my whole face in its mouth, and crushing the bones, slung me around and shook me until I was senseless. And for many days it was quite unnecessary for me to make believe dead, because I was on the very doorstep of eternity." Jim was horribly mangled, bones broken generally, and the flesh in places literally stripped from his limbs and body. Colonel William Butts was, in 1854 and 1855, senior editor of the Southern Californian, published under the firm name of Butts and Wheeler, John O. Wheeler being the associate editor. The paper was mostly conducted and edited with a degree of ability rarely exceeded within the limits of the state. Butts was an adopted son of the great Thomas Benton, and he had served as an officer in the regular army, a daring spirit who always courted danger and sought adventure. Was, in 53, the hero of a bear fight, the most remarkable of which I ever had knowledge. It happened in San Luis Obispo County. I believe it was at the ranch of Captain Wilson that a party was made up to kill an immense grizzly who would pick up a full-grown cow and walk away with it in her mouth with as much ease as a mastiff would carry a rabbit. Butts was the only one of the party whom I knew, and as he was the hero, is the only one to be mentioned. The grizzly was found on the edge of a plain near the chaparral and was immediately attacked by the hunters, who lodged several balls in his body with which he escaped. The party commenced to beat the bush to get the bear out. Butts followed the bear trail into the thicket. The trail soon entered the dry, gravelly bed of an arroyo and was easily followed. But Butts had followed the bear's track for about a half mile when suddenly he lost it. Being confused, he stopped to deliberate and was standing within a few feet of the bear that had laid down in the shade of a clump of chaparral on the side. With a great growl, it sprang upon him so suddenly that he had no possible chance of using his pistol. But as he went down under the ponderous weight of the bear, he got his hunting knife out of its scabbard, and then the mortal strife commenced. Butts declared that he never lost his presence of mind, but endeavored to stab the bear in its vital parts, and that time after time he thrust his 8-inch blade to the hilt in the bear's body as it stood over him, biting and tearing him with its claws. Butts said, "The last sensation I had was the brute dragging itself over me and its entrails trailing across my face." A half hour later, the two combatants were found. The bear dead, Butts torn into pieces. After examination showed that the bones of his face were so crushed that he was disfigured for life. The bones of his left arm and right leg were fractured in several places. Some of his ribs were crushed, and his body and legs were literally cut into strips. It turned out that the bear had been severely wounded by the shots fired into it, but not mortally. That Butts' knife had twice penetrated the lungs and once entered the heart, and that the incision was made in its bowels nearly a foot long. A litter was hastily constructed, and poor Butts was carefully carried to the ranch, a surgeon sent for, and then some of the party, with some Indians and a Mexican cart and ox, went for the bear, which, after an immense amount of difficulty, was successfully transported to the ranch, skinned, cut into pieces, and when weighed, pulled down 2,100 pounds. Almost incredible to believe. We had a bull and bear fight here in Los Angeles in 1854. The bear was a half-grown young fellow and would have weighed not exceeding 500 or 600 pounds. Colonel Butts went to the arena to take a look at the combatants prior to the fight. After examining the bear critically, he turned away, remarking, "Well, if I couldn't whip that bear in a rough and tumble, I wouldn't consider myself anything in a bear fight." Although possessed of considerable capital and with a rare editorial ability, the restless spirit of the gallant Butts must find a more prolific field for adventure than the dull times that fell upon California in 1855 and 56. So with a legion of others of like spirit, he went to Nicaragua too, in upholding the flaunting flag of manifest destiny, and was there so wounded and riddled with bullets that after his return to Ohio, the place of his birth, he died thereof. The City of Angels never had in her firmament a brighter star than that of the brave and talented Butts. In 1854, Andy Subletti was mortally injured by a bear in one of the canyons near Santa Monica. I believe it was Malibu, commonly called Malaga. And primarily, I must state who Andy Subletti was, and then how he came to be killed. There were 3 brothers of the Subletti family, Bill, Andy, and the other one's name I forget. Andy being the only one known to me personally. The Sublettis were Rocky Mountain princes, leaders among the mountaineers of the times anterior to Fremont's explorations, the Mexican War, and the Golden Crusade to California. They were the founders of Fort Laramie, from which stronghold they dictated terms of peace to the haughty tribes of the Rocky Mountains, and declared war when war was more to their fancy than peace. The Subletties sold Laramie to the American Fur Company, of which one of the chateaus of St. Louis was chief. That company, in 1848, I believe, sold the fort to the United States, and it has since then been maintained as a military post. What memories of romance and adventures cluster around that romantic and historic place, in the spur of the great mountain chain. Emerson Bennett, in his Pictures of Indian Life, casts a halo of interest around Laramie that is perfectly enchanting. It is a beautiful and romantic spot situated on the west bank of the Laramie Fork of the Platte, a few miles from its confluence with the latter stream. In June of 1850, on our journey hither, we stopped at Laramie for a week and cut our wagons up and made them into pack saddles and traded our fine American horses to Kit Carson for Mexican mules preparatory to encountering the Great Barrier. Well, as I before said, Andy Subletti was a Rocky Mountain prince, and in addition thereto was a natural-born gentleman, with manners as refined, gentle, and polished as though he had never been beyond the confines of the most cultivated society. And I must say almost the same of all that old first-class Rocky Mountain men. They were particularly sedate and quiet in their manners. Andy had only recovered from severe injuries received in an encounter with a bear at Elizabeth Lake when in the company with Jim Thompson. He went on a bear hunt that was to be his last. Somehow or the other, he became separated from the party and found a grizzly and shot him. But before he could reload, the fierce brute was upon him. Poor Andy. It was the last fight, and gallantly did he maintain his former renown. His faithful dog, Old Buck, was with him, and the two fought, Andy with his knife and Old Buck with the weapons furnished by nature, and gained the victory over the Mountain King. When Thompson found them, the bear lay dead. Andy was insensible, and Old Buck, lacerated in a shocking manner, was licking the blood from poor Andy's face. Tenderly were the two, man and dog, brought to the city and comfortably lodged and cared for in the present U.S. hotel corner. For many days, the struggle between life and death was fierce. Sometimes Andy would get the better of the grim destroyer, only to again be driven to the wall. Old Buck was as tenderly cared for as was his gallant master, Jim Thompson, with his great good heart, watching night and day by the bedside of the two heroes, while other friends stood ready to assist. Old Buck lay on a nice pallet at the side of Andy's bed. When his master was unconscious, the old dog would almost break his heart with subdued moaning. And when Andy, in his delirium, would imagine himself still fighting the bear and would say, "Seize him, Buck. At him, old fellow. We'll get him," and like expressions, Old Buck would raise his forepaw on the side of the bed and would give a growl. Finally, death came out first best, as he always does, and poor Andy was one of the first to be interned in the Fort Hill Cemetery. Old Buck rode in the wagon that took Andy to his last resting place, he and Jim Thompson being chief mourners. About every gringo in the place turned out at Andy's funeral, and it is safe to say that there was not one person who left that graveyard with tearless eyes on account of the loss of a gallant man, a friend, a Christian neighbor, but for the doleful distress of poor old Buck, who utterly refused to be comforted and to be moved from his dead master's grave. So there he was left to exhaust his grief, which we all thought he would do in a little while. Twice and sometimes 3 times a day, Jim Thompson and other kind-hearted friends would take Buck food and drink, and tried in vain to induce him to leave the grave. The faithful old dog refused to be comforted, refused to eat or drink, and on the 3rd day died, and was buried at the feet of his dead master. Does the reader believe that dog had a soul worth saving, a soul that was saved, or that when old Buck died of grief, when his heart was broken, that was the end of the brave, faithful, honest old dog? Or that when Gabriel sounds his resurrection horn, that the spirit of Andy will be reunited in a happy hunting ground with the spirit of his old faithful friend? We will see. Bears are sometimes particular as well as dogs, and one of the most particular and funny freaks of a bear I know of is the following, which is a well-known fact, and an infantile hero of this bear story was a well-known and prominent man in our country, quite recently deceased. Well, the story is to this effect. A ranchero who dwelt near the mountain's base near our Angel had a wife and one child, a little boy about 3 years old. The husband was absent one day, as was his daily habit, looking after his herds, and the young wife, leaving the little Vicente to manage his own affairs, went to the spring to wash some clothes, being absent about an hour. When she returned, her alarm and horror to find an immense grizzly playing pranks and cutting up rusties with the infantile Vicente, the two seeming to be on terms of the most affectionate intimacy. The old bear would lay on her back and would hold the little fellow up with her great paws and would toss him around tenderly and hug him. And the little Don would scream with delight, so pleased he seemed to be with his newfound friend. What was to be done was the absorbing question in the mind of the poor mother. So the only thing she could do was to pray to the saints to deliver her boy. But the boy did not want to be delivered, and the two newly made and strange acquaintances continued their fun until near the close of day, when Madame Osa, leaving little Vicente, who was fain to follow, took up her line of march from her home in the Sierra. The anxious mother lost no time in securing the youthful renegade, and who had conceived so strange an affection for a bear, and who in later years was to speak of as Mama La Osa. I wanted to end the bear story on kind of a happy note, but as of today, there are no grizzly bears living in the wild at all in California. They hunted them down and killed them all because they were so ferocious and man-eating. And that is why the big, cute, man-eating grizzly bear is on the California flag. You may not know this, but scalping was not started by the Native Americans. It was what the white people brought over, and they adopted it. But I want to look at a story here of why it's dangerous to put a price on somebody's head, especially in the Mad Wild West. I call this the scalpers. El Paso, September 23rd, 1880. Governor Terrares offers a reward of $1,000 for the scalp of Victorio. On the reading of the above, it occurred to the mind of the chronicler hereof that Chihuahua's governor should use a careful discrimination and make sure of the identity of the scalp referred to before he paid out his coin, or he might be cheated and get one other than that of the celebrated Victorio. Dealing in scalps is a dangerous business, as the sequel will show. Those who have read Mustang Gray will remember that the hero of that book, a real character, was a noted Texas Ranger, that he had a boy protege, John Glanton by name, whom he instructed in all the mysteries of Indian fighting, hunting, trailing, lassoing mustangs, and scalping an occasional Mexican whose appearance failed to favorably impress the two heroes. At 15 years of age, John was one of the most noted rangers on the frontier. At 16, he was captain of a ranger company, and as such served through the Mexican War and won great renown as a scout. Sometime during the summer of 1849, Glanton, at the head of a party of desperate adventurers, left San Antonio overland for California, leaving behind him a newly wedded wife, a most estimable and highly cultured lady of one of the best families of the romantic frontier city. The expedition, in due course of time, arrived in Chihuahua and halted for recreation and pleasure. At this time, the Apaches were particularly bold in their raids, murdering citizens and desolating villages and outlying ranchos. They had become so annoying that governor of the state offered 2 ounces, $32, for each and every Apache scalp taken by anyone whomsoever. As a side note here, I actually Googled how much $32 in 1850 would be worth today. And when I Googled it, it's saying it'd be worth $1,068.26 as of December 2020. So they were going to pay him $1,068.26 per scalp. So keep that in mind as we go through this story. Glanton and his party proposed a campaign, but had not the necessary means of procuring supplies. At this juncture, Benjamin Riddle, a merchant and American consul, and John Abel, an American resident, patriotically supplied the cash of $2,500 on the venture. And being thus supplied with the sinews of war, Glanton lost no time in preparation and was soon on the warpath. The campaign was brief, bloody, and brilliant, and productive of a bountiful supply of scalps. The Apache warriors, accustomed to cope with a unwieldy, half-starved, ill-paid, and poorly armed Mexican troop, whom, if unable to whip, they could always elude by their movements, were taken completely by surprise by this new foe, who carried a pair of 6-shooting pistols of that terrible old Texas pattern in their holsters, and a navy at their belt, their only arms except the bowie. Well mounted, thoroughly trained in the arts of Indian warfare, of such esprit de corps as led every man to do his utmost to excel his comrades in the carnival of blood, Glanton and his rangers made an easy campaign and a brilliant success. Returning to Chihuahua, they were publicly received at the governor's palace, marched under triumph arches, delivered their scalps to the government agent, received 2 doubloons for each scalp, where they feasted and made the lions of the town in that great Mexican capital. Fandangos, gambling, and the carousing succeeded for the month following, and the restive rangers were ready for another campaign. So confident had the authorities become that they gratuitously furnished supplies for the second campaign, and the scalp hunters were again on the warpath. The second campaign was more brief and productive than the first, and the good citizens of Chihuahua congratulated themselves, returned thanks to the saints, feasted the rangers, and believed the period for exterminating had finally come. Shortly after the second campaign, it was whispered around that Mexican rancheros had been killed and scalped by their foes other than the Apaches. Matters became dangerously suspicious, and the rangers were on alert. The trouble with the authorities of Chihuahua was the difficulty of distinguishing between the scalp of an Apache and that of a Mexican. The rangers who remembered the Alamo, Goliad, and other places of Mexican outrage and blood hated the Mexican more than they did the Apache. And, as with them, it was a question of dollar and cents, and not of either love or patriotism, had found it more convenient and less hazardous to raise the hair of a Mexican than that of an Apache, and such was the product of the second campaign. The Mexicans are a gentle people and have more virtue than ever given credit for. They are not an excitable people, and as people are hard to raise, but when once raised, as they were on the memorable Cinco de Mayo, they are more irresistible than the hurricane or the piercing northern that sweeps their favored land. Once raised, they are a fury. As a people, they are not raised against the American invasion of 1846. As a people, they were raised against the French and Austrians in 61 and 67, and astonished the world with their deeds of devotion and heroism. When Glanton and his rangers heard of the murmur of the coming storm, they, disassembling innocents, prepared to escape it and flee the wrath to come. That is to say, they quietly, and in the hour when honest people seek their pillow and thieves do go abroad, saddle their well-fed chargers and cut stick for the shores of the Western Ocean. Pursuit was organized, but too late. The bloody scalpers had escaped. They had secured safety by their well-timed departure and the fleetness of the horses. The next we hear Glanton and his desperate band in the mining town of Jesus Maria in the northern part of Sonora, where Messer W.T.B. Stanford, afterward of Los Angeles, and Frank Carroll, he who kept the whiskey mill in the priest cottage residence at San Gabriel, were the only American traders. The Glanton party held high carnival during their short tarry at this obscure Mexican village, which the simple-minded bore with their usual patience until Glanton perpetrated the last outrage, which raised a second storm, from which the festive fellows were again glad to escape by taking to their heels and plying spur. John Glanton rode into Cuartel, hauled down the Mexican flag, tied it to a mule tail, lashed the mule into a fury, and turned it loose in the town. The Rangers escaped the fury of the outraged populace. So did Sanford and Carroll. but the two latter escaped on foot, leaving behind them to the fury of the mob. Their stores, accumulations of hard years of toil and danger, and barely got away with their lives. Arriving at Tucson, the Rangers found the place besieged by the renowned Apache chief Mangus Colorado, the place being defended by a handful of frightened Mexican soldiers, a few old men, and the boys, the able-bodied men, having gone in a body to the new El Dorado in California. The Rangers rode through the Apaches into the besieged town and joined its frightened defenders. Mangus Colorado then surrounded a parley and with several of his chiefs met Glenn under some cottonwood trees at the Little Singa east of and just outside of town. The great chief, the Apaches never had a greater than Mangus, expressed his surprise at the Americans assisting their enemies, the Mexicans, and fighting against those whom they should treat as friends and allies. Glanton, however, informed him that the Americans always defended the weak, and that unless the arrogant chief and his barbarous horde should depart before sunrise the following day, the Americans would turn loose their saddles on them, meaning, in the expressive Apache dialect, their holstered pistols, and something the Mexican cavalry never carried. Mangus said he would not fight his amigos, the Americans, but proposed that if permitted to slaughter 7 bulls to be furnished by the Mexicans and feast his warriors thereon in the plaza of Tucson, and to drink mescal himself with the American chief while his warriors were so feasting, he would depart in peace. He said he did all he could to restrain his braves from killing Mexicans, and as a general thing, as contrary to his policy, he said, if we kill off the Mexicans, who will raise cattle and horses for us? The proposed plan was agreed to, and the program carried out to the letter, the Rangers preserving an armed neutrality in the meantime. After which, Mangus Colorado, which means red mantle, quietly withdrew his barbarians and departed. Then came another carnival of joy. The grateful Tucsonians piled the Rangers with every comfort and delicacy that poor town afforded, refusing them nothing, and the old men wept and the women wailed when their deliverers departed. This was the last act of American manhood performed by that brave band of abandoned men. Arriving at Yuma, they found a solitary American who kept a ferry boat, and an immense number of Indians camped at and near the crossing. The poor ferryman, after crossing the party over, was murdered by some of the band because he persisted in his denial of having mescal. Dave and Charlie Brown, the 2 survivors of the Glanton band, informed the chronicler of the termination of this bloody ride. The party camped on a grassy flat on the widest side of the river, just below the crossing, and quietly passed the night. Early in the morning, the camp was astir, preparatory to resuming their line of march over the great desert. The 2 Browns had, at early dawn, gone to the ferry boat with camp kettles to procure water with which to cook breakfast. While they were at the river, the Rangers' camp was secretly surrounded by the Yuma Indians, under old Pasquale, a venerated chief of today, who, to avenge the murder of their friend the ferryman, massacred the whole party, save only Dave and Charlie, as before stated. When the camp was attacked, they, with well-timed judgment, quietly boarded the ferry boat, shoved into the stream, and floated down the river wholly unobserved by the Indians, who supposed they had killed the whole party. After descending the stream a few miles, the 2 survivors landed, filled their camp kettles with water, and started westward across the desert, and after unparalleled suffering arrived at San Diego in the condition little better than walking skeletons. And such is the history of John Glanton and his scalp hunters, and such their deplorable end. The 2 Brown brothers were not of kin, Dave being a red-headed, good-natured American, while Charlie was a quarter-blood Cherokee. Dave was hung at Los Angeles in 1854 by an irate mob of California Mexicans, most of whom were his personal friends, and hung him only in vindication of principle. This is to say, the Americans of the Angel City were in the habit of amusing themselves by hanging some luckless Mexican, and the Mexicans wished to show that they could play at the same game, and so seized the poor Dave as a fit subject for demonstration, apologized for the liberty they were taking with him, which Dave laughingly accepted, and was then swung up. Dave had always lived the life of an unprincipled fellow. He died in vindication of a principle. That is to show that the native Californians knew how to hang a man in the most approved gringo fashion. The other Brown also fell a victim to principle. He went to Nicaragua under the banner of manifest destiny and died in vindication of the principles thereof. Poor Dave set a most beautiful example to the young people who witnessed this interesting taking off. He said that he had committed a great many crimes, but not of sufficient magnitude to deserve hanging. The only great crime he had ever seriously contemplated was running for councilman of our pure and lovely municipality. And should he have done so, and been elected, and have served, then, quote, I would have felt I deserved death. But fortunately, said Dave, in going into the presence of the great judge, I can at least claim that I was never either mayor or member of the Los Angeles City Council. Alas, poor Dave, his crimes were many, but the last mentioned were not charged up against him in the kingdom come. Some years ago, the writer was in San Antonio, where he frequently met a pale, sorrowful-looking elderly lady, accompanied by a younger one. The latter very beautiful, both in deep mourning, one the widow, the other the daughter of the reckless Glanton, the Chihuahua scalp hunter. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode and the crazy stories. And until the next episode, keep your horses tied up. Thanks for listening. The Mad Wild West Podcast. These are the true